Hello and welcome to Using Popular Education to Engage Communities in Sexual Violence Prevention. This is Ashley Meyer with Prevent Connect, and I'm so pleased to have you all here with us today. I see folks are putting the text chat, they're typing in where they're calling in from and what the weather's like there. And we have quite a range of folks all the way from here in Southern California where I am and where it's sunny but a little bit cool for our weather here, all the way to 25 degrees south of Morocco. We have Graham, a former guest on Prevent Connect web conferences and podcasts, calling in from Scotland, and we have Florida, Missouri, we have some snow happening, we have all sorts of, we have Guam, welcome Guam, so very many different time zones. So if you're at an interesting time other than what I put at the very beginning of the text chat, other than 11 a.m. Pacific time or 1 p.m. Central time or 2 p.m. Eastern, please go ahead and share that time so we get a sense of what it's like, where you're all coming from, and what the group is that's here today. So we are being recorded, and I just want to remind you all that there will be times where we invite you to participate over the phone to answer some questions, share examples and such. And we really encourage you to do that, and also remind you that this is being recorded. So again, you have called and logged into Using Popular Education to Engage Communities in Sexual Violence Prevention with our partners, the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. And when I say our, I am referring to Prevent Connect. And if you have not already, please do check out our website. I have posted and will continue posting in the text chat that on preventconnect.org there is access to the slides, and then after this web conference there will be a recording and text chat transcript posted on preventconnect.org. I will continue to post the direct link into the text chat. So we also have email groups. We have a wiki, an e-learning site, as well as a whole bunch of social media. So lots of ways to participate in what we are, which is a community. We're a community of practice, and we focus on the prevention of sexual, domestic, dating, and related forms of violence. And right away, before I tell you how to use the technology, I want to invite in our host here, Donna Lecco from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, which I will likely be referring to as NSVRC. Hi, Donna.
Hi, Ashley, and hi, everyone. So excited to be here.
Great. And Donna, what's the weather like where you are?
It is in the high 20s, low 30s, and we had some snow this morning, but it is tapering off. So the sun is trying to get out, which is great.
Yes, sun's always good when it's in the 20s. It's below 30 degrees. Wow, that's different than what it's like where I am. So I will not make you feel jealous by telling you what the weather's like in Pasadena, California. So Donna, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to let the audience know how to use the technology. So you all can raise your hand, and I invite you to do that by clicking on the hand that is on the top left of your screen. It says My Status. Looks like you all are going ahead and doing that, and I'm seeing about 18 hands raised. So if more of you could just click that hand, let me know that you see how to get my attention. And so you can raise your hand, and we will note that you are on the My Status with your hand raised. So that is great. So I'm seeing more and more of you doing that. I'm going to go ahead and lower all hands. So feel free to raise your hand. And if you are having any tech issues, I did at the top of the text chat. I will put that in again in a little bit. Put this number, 800-799-4510. That is iLink Technical Support. Free to call them if you are needing technical support or having any issues. You can also private chat me to see if maybe I can help you out when I'm not focused on talking to our presenters or what's on the slides. I will try to check that private tab that's on the top right of your screen as much as possible. Do encourage you to continue the conversations, answer the questions in the public chat. If you want to share information not with everybody but maybe with one or two people or have a kind of side conversation, we encourage you to use that private chat tab as well. Again, that's on the top right of your screen in that chat box. So I have said that the PowerPoint slides are available. Continue to post that link. I am going to ask you some polling questions, so I'll do that right after this slide. And closed captioning is available, and I will be putting some more information about that in the text chat. And we really want to thank our partners at Aberdeen for their wonderful work with captioning during our web conferences here at Prevent Connect. Please adhere to very typical, respectful communication guidelines during today's web conference. We always have great conversations and hope to continue to do that today. So Prevent Connect is a national project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, sponsored by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the U.S. government, CDC, or TAASA. Let me ask you a couple questions. And Donna, I would like to first ask the audience, have you attended a Prevent Connect web conference before? So if, Donna, can you confirm for me that you're seeing that question on the screen?
I am.
Great. All right. So go ahead and type on the screen, no, this is my first Prevent Connect web conference, or yes, this is the first, oh sorry, I'm reading them wrong. Yes, this is the first Prevent Connect web conference. The one before that is no, I haven't done that before. We have 1 to 2, 3 or more. So Donna, I'm sharing the results right now, and you can continue to put your answers in the on the screen as well. Just click the button, the round choice that you have there. And it looks like we have quite a few who have attended 3 or more. So we have some folks who are coming back, and we have about 14% right now who are saying no, this is their first web conference. So welcome to you all, and it's great to see both returning and new users on our web conferences, and we have some great information for you today. So I'm going to take that question away, and let's see who is here. So please answer again the same way you did on your screen. What best describes your organization or agency? So are you a sexual violence agency or coalition, domestic violence agency or coalition? Are you dual? Maybe you're a college or university, you're at a state or territory or federal public health department, or you're with state, territory, federal government, tribal organization, education, K through 12, child abuse, HIV, STI prevention, reproductive health, mental health, healthcare, LGBTQ organization, community-based organization, faith-based, military, criminal justice, you're a funder, foundation, or other. And if you're other, please go ahead and type that into the text chat. And Jennifer Grove from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center is showing you the other option and typing in that she's a National Technical Assistance Provider. So hi Jen. Anybody else, please go ahead if you're an other, type that in. Public health, adolescent health, legal aid, social worker, yes. So go ahead and please continue to answer that. I'm going to show you the results here. Oh wow, Donna. Looks like we have a lot of folks who are working in sexual violence and also dual sexual and domestic violence agencies. We have also a strong contingent from the colleges and the universities as well.
That's great.
Great, and a few just sprinkled throughout, some 1 or 2 percentages with education, child abuse, healthcare, faith-based, community-based, criminal justice, and some other as well. So it's really great to see you all here. We love the community that this space creates, and really encourage you to share with each other because you all bring such great information and experiences to our Prevent Connect web conferences. So I'm going to take that question away and wait for this to change. So I'm going to go ahead and move that for everybody. You should be back on how to use this technology. And those were the polling questions. Phone is the probably best audio choice. If you're having any issues hearing us over the computer audio, go ahead and you can call in, and we will post that number in the text chat very, very shortly. If someone gets to it before me, then thank you. So again, I mentioned closed captioning is available. We'll put more information about that in the text chat. And we shall just say a little bit more about Prevent Connect. We do focus on domestic violence, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, but also violence across the lifespan. We really want to prevent violence before it starts. And we're all about this word right here. David Lee, who is on, let me put his picture up, just posted a great blog post about connection and that word. And what does that mean? Well, for us at Prevent Connect, as he said, it's not just connecting to other forms of violence and issues, but we really want to connect to each other. So that's what we're all about, and that's why I'm so happy that you're all here today to talk about popular education. So we do have, today is February 26th, obviously, but we do have some other, quite a few other web conferences coming up, and we will let you know as soon as registration is open for those. Please go ahead and check preventconnect.org, and you will find out just as soon as possible when those are available. So again, just a big thank you to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center for co-hosting this. And you'll hear a little bit more coming up about where this idea, where this topic came from. Our guests today are three fabulous people. We have Roberto. Roberto, hello.
Hey there.
Hey. So you will be sharing throughout, as well as Morgan. Hi, Morgan.
Hi.
And Tim.
Hello.
So we have Roberto is from a number of places actually, Roberto. So Roberto, do you want to say a little bit more about the work that you do?
Sure. So I am currently temporarily based in New York City, but I claim the southeast of the United States as a place where I do political work and where I came up politically. Specifically the Highlander Research and Education Center, which is a 80-year-old institution that does nothing but popular education. And so I work with organizations that are trying to develop both their popular education practice, and more specifically I do work around language and work with organizations that are trying to also build their multilingual capacity because maybe they serve a multilingual base, and work with organizations to figure out how it is that the work that they do can encompass all the voices in their community by bringing down language barriers.
Absolutely fabulous. So we're really looking forward to talking to you and hearing from you and learning from you today. So thank you so much for joining us. Morgan and Tim, you are both at the same organization at TAASA, so why don't you introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Morgan. I've been here at TAASA about 9.5 years, doing mostly capacity building around prevention and evaluation, and I'm currently the Deputy Director working on strategic planning and also evaluation capacity building primarily now.
And I'm Tim. I've also been with TAASA for 9.5 years, minus 2 weeks for Morgan. And I am currently the Prevention Program Director. And so we are primarily focused on building capacity of local organizations to develop effective prevention programming, as well as continuing to kind of further the conversation around effective prevention practice at the state level.
Wonderful. It's so great to have such a strong team of guests here with us today. And I also want to mention that we do have Abby Sims and Dina Fulton from our Prevent Connect team as well here with us today. You'll be hearing from them in the text chat as well. So thank you everybody for joining us. And now I want to bring in Donna for just a quick look at why are we doing this? Why popular education?
Sure. So what you're seeing on this slide is an image of an infographic of some of the key findings from an assessment that the NSVRC conducted back in 2009 and 2010 in collaboration with the Multilingual Access Project Advisory Committee, which we lovingly refer to as MAPA, and with the University of Puerto Rico. And the goal of our assessment was really to better understand the current, at the time, strengths and needs in preventing sexual violence with Latina and Latino communities. And what we learned really confirmed what we'd been hearing from our partners in culturally specific organizations, that there was really this need in the field for stronger community collaborations. People were saying that we really needed stronger culturally informed resources and prevention strategies, and that our organizations really were needing some capacity building work to really mobilize, as Roberto said, language access and other culturally relevant approaches to prevention and response. So this is kind of where some of this began. And as we, if you go to the next slide, Ashley, as we kind of continued on this journey, since the assessment, I know many of us at the NSVRC are so excited as we're learning more about popular education as a framework that really honors the intersectionality of people's lives and their capacities to mobilize and to really affect change. As a social worker, I wish I had learned about this approach decades ago, and I know, Ashley, you and I have talked about that, because as we'll hear today, popular education is really about people. It's about meeting them where they're at. It's hearing their stories and experiences with oppression and with resilience, and really then working together as partners to affect change, which to me is just a beautiful model for sexual violence prevention. So I'm so excited that we're doing this today.
Great, and I am just so thankful that you kind of brought up this issue for us. And we partner between NSVRC and Prevent Connect on a number of prevention issues, and this was one that I say from UIUC to RPE. So for me, popular education was something I learned about in a psychology class that was focused on neighborhoods at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, which is where I did my undergrad in psychology and French, which is neither here nor there. But I learned about it there, and I learned about this thing called oppression, and I learned about Freire's work, and it was just a fabulous world to be in, and to really learn about this and to apply it to neighborhood work in cities like Chicago was very interesting and really eye-opening for me as I was a young undergraduate college student. And then throughout my work, fast forward many years later, I had seen this being used at the local level. So when I was really coordinating the Rape Prevention and Education Program, which is a CDC-funded prevention initiative that is in every state, when I was there in Oregon, I really saw this being used to really engage communities such as Latino and Latina communities in Portland, for example, in Portland, Oregon. And it was just something that I saw being so powerful. And really, we always say, what do we want to change? We're doing this work to what end? I saw those changes happening, and it was through this thing that I realized was really called popular education. So that's what we're going to focus on today. And I also want to bring in quickly David Lee, who is also a member of our Prevent Connect team. Of course, David Lee has been with Prevent Connect for its 10 years. Hi, David.
Hi, I'm doing great. I was muted, so I had to pause for a second. This is such an important topic for me, and I'm really so excited. And it's Roberto. I'm so thrilled talking about Highlander Institute. That is an organization who I have long admired, and some of my favorite books are and Miles Horton, who is the founder there, is one of my heroes in doing our work. So it's just so much of, I think, going to really help inform and think about how we can really help create change and really align with our history and looking at what we can learn from the civil rights movement, from the union movement, which have used these strategies to really create dramatic change. So I'm looking forward to being a participant here. So I'm going to let you go. Take the podium back, Ashley.
Okay, I will take the podium, David. Thank you so much. All right. So first I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put up a feedback question, which actually I have moved to the other side of your screen. Let me move it back and realize it's there. So now it should be where the arrow is pointing. And I'm going to ask you all yes or no. So please click on the answer on the left bottom of your screen, yes or no. Are you familiar with popular education? I'm going to share the results in real time. Donna, right now it looks like we have a majority saying no, that they're not familiar, but we do have a percentage right now, it's at 30, it's going a little lower, who are saying they are. So I think this will be a really, like I said, I was a kind of a fresh undergrad college student when I learned about this, and I said it was eye-opening, and I'm hoping that this is a really useful session for folks and really going to introduce to them a tool that they may be able to use to reach their goals and to create outcomes for sexual violence prevention. Okay. All right, so it looks like we're done with that poll. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to withdraw that. So that's going to go away. So thank you all for sharing. And Roberto, welcome. Welcome back. I know we introduced you just a few slides earlier. But I really want to hand the podium to you to really talk about this concept of popular education.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for being here today. I realized when I introduced myself that I didn't say thank you and good afternoon or good morning or good evening, wherever it is that you find yourself. So right off the bat, I would say I would invite folks to really participate, and to participate not just through texting the messages, but to actually let us hear your voices. At its most basic, popular education means education of the people. And as we're going to delve into it more, it'll become like clearly evident why the voices in this room, just like the voices in any room where folks are doing work, are really important. So as we pose questions out to the audience, I would invite folks to raise your hand to be able to offer and share something like verbally with us. And Ashley, who is taking care of the tech, will unmute a couple folks so that we can get some answers. Right now it looks like there's 138 folks on, and so obviously we won't have the opportunity to hear from everyone, but definitely we want to have a feedback loop and be able to have a conversation as best that we can. And also I want to say before starting this, I'm really excited to be doing this, and this is going to be the broadest conversation / definition of popular education that you could possibly get. And so for the folks that answered the polling question that you are familiar with popular education, I'm sure that you might notice a lot of gaps or a lot of other things that would make the conversation even richer. So I just want to apologize now for the beginning that we're not going to be able to delve into it really, really deeply. But I'd like to start with a question, and I'd like to start with the knowledge that's in this room right now, and ask the question, what do folks know, or what have folks heard about popular education? Like, what comes to mind when you hear the term popular education?
Great. So go ahead and share in the text chat, or you can raise your hand if you'd like to answer over the phone. But what do you know, or what comes to mind when you think about popular education? Okay. So, David, thank you for typing that question in. So Roberto Maria is saying building off of people's experience and treating them as the experts in their lives. Love that. Sierra, access to social change making. Bonnie, what people learn and understand together. We have some anti-oppression, thinking or outside of the box. Jen says popular education is K through 12 public schools is what people think about a framework that was developed specifically for work with communities with limited access to education and resources, schools and universities. What do you think about that sharing and those thoughts, Roberto?
So I would say, like, just based on how fast and furious those are coming and how fast I'm seeing them pop up on the screen. So already it shows like just how much knowledge there is in the room from the people that are already here. And that is one of the basic principles of popular education, is to always start with what is that folks in the room already know. respect. It's a basic respect of people's lived experiences and everything that has taught them. And so everything that folks mentioned and the answers, were correct and make a part of like popular education. At its most basic, popular education is pushing against this idea of education as a banking model, or the way that many of us are like taught to learn, where the learners are really just like repositories of information. There's someone that's designated the expert in the room, and the learner's job is basically to absorb whatever it is that they're being told and be able to recapitulate it. Another central tenet of popular education is that the people are experts in their lives. Who better to come up with a plan for how to face the challenges in their lives or the things that oppress them than the people that are actually living them. And another important part of that is not just the expertise that comes with lived experience, but that the people that are most impacted by any particular issue should be the people that are at the center of the work and bringing the leadership of the work to that. And so I guess my next question to you all, given all that, why would folks think, especially in the field that you folks work in, why would that be an advantageous approach to do this work based on the expertise of people's lived experiences and centering the people most impacted?
Okay, so why is that an important approach? Looks like there's a conversation about TV as well going on, and talking about that as popular education. And we have some answers for why is that an important approach, which looks like Jody saying empowerment, Courtney saying yield trust in relationships, Graham from Scotland saying allows you to engage rather than, I think that's indict. Am I using the right word? Rebecca, it'll be more effective and impactful. So starts with people are, it equalizes knowledge, ownership, empowerment, sharing knowledge. I'm seeing a theme here of engaging, sharing knowledge, and really turning to community ownership.
Great. Those are all excellent. One of the words that I see coming up over and over again is the word empowerment. And as somebody who has been in a lot of the spaces that you folks work in doing this work, and have come over the years to see how the particular anti-violence movement, domestic violence, sexual violence movement has changed to empower survivors and to put the decisions in their hands. And using popular education methodology in trying to formulate work at a local level, work that actually meets the needs of folks, not just in terms of the actual issue, but that also fits with them culturally, can be very, very empowering, because then it doesn't feel like there's someone from the outside saying, hey, I know better, or I know all this stuff about this stuff that's happening to you, so let me tell you about it. So that feeling of empowerment, and I'm going to move forward a slide a little bit. You folks will notice that I'm not always very linear, but one of the popular education is often called education for liberation, and you can take liberation to mean you can expand on that or give it whatever definition you want. And before we get back to trying to having a dialogue in terms of what popular education may mean to you and to your work, I want to give just a very, very brief history and context in terms of the roots of popular education. And probably the three most branches of the history of popular education that are best known was the Danish folk schools that started in the 1800s that came from this movement of of adult education, of trying to educate folks and to give them skills that would be able to give them more economic mobility, but also to push away from this very elitist university type thinking, and understanding that there are other ways that people learn, and that there are other things of value in education, and pushing away of this relationship between a student and a book. Then also really well known is Paulo Freire in Brazil. Paulo Freire, who was born in poverty in Brazil and became a lifelong advocate of popular education. He was the person who really kind of brought a critical politic or a radical politic to this idea of popular education. And he would talk about in his memoirs how he came to understand as a child how his poverty and the fact that he was always hungry kept him from learning, kept him from being able to to get an education. At a certain point in his life, he was like 4 grades behind from what he should have been. And so he dedicated the rest of his life to working at the intersection of poverty and education, understanding that folks, that education was the way that folks were going to be able to come up with a plan to be able to resist the economic oppression that they were suffering. And an interesting thing about Paulo Freire was when he first started this work, literacy was a requirement for voting in Brazil. And Paulo Freire had this pilot program where he was able to teach 300 sugarcane workers how to read in 45 days. And that was such an astonishing and powerful thing that the government was going to create a whole department to be able to continue that work. And then there was a military coup, and Paulo Freire was exiled, and that work didn't continue until many years later. And I make that connection between literacy and popular education because that tradition also continued here in the United States. And the Highlander Center, which was founded in the early 1930s, was founded as a labor school, and for many years was the official training school of the CIO in this country, and used popular education since its founding. But probably the part of history that it's most known for is the era of the civil rights, is the era during the late 50s, early 60s when things were starting to move in the South, and folks were starting to organize for themselves how to resist what was happening. And for folks that may know the history of the United States or perhaps just saw the movie Selma, literacy was also a requirement to be able to vote, which is why many black folks in the South were denied the vote because they weren't able to access education. And so Highlander came up with the citizenship schools, and it was basically teaching folks how to read so that they would be able to vote. And it was about meeting folks where they were at and going to their communities. And a lot of these classes, a lot of these literacy classes happened in black barbershops and black beauty salons because they were among the very few places where white folks were never going to come in. And so folks would come to their local black barbershop and they would learn how to read, and many times the tools that would use to teach them to read would be letters from families or things that folks used in their everyday life to be able to teach them to read. And as folks became more literate, of course, then they were able to become more eligible to vote. And I like that story because it connects a couple ideas together. One is it connects this idea of justice to people's autonomy and also to literacy, how important it is for folks to read. And I think sometimes when people talk about popular education, it becomes the focus is on the liberation around the oppression and organizing, and that is certainly very important. But that comes through people actually learning concrete skills. And so popular education is used to teach people to read. It's used to teach people math. It's used to teach folks things that are needed in everyday life that you would learn in a school. So please pardon me while I take just a short sip of water.
And Roberto, I think that's part of the power of popular education for me when we're talking about applying it to sexual and domestic violence prevention is exactly what you're talking about. It's for lack of a better term, it's a real strategy. It's something that has been used, and we're just talking about the history of the United States right now, but it's really been used throughout history by people in their communities, community members. It's what everyone was saying. It's about community ownership. It really exists at that community level, and it also links to what we talk about a lot when we're talking about sexual and domestic violence prevention, which is linking to other issues, right? Linking to people's real life issues in addition to the violence in their lives, but things like you're talking about, literacy, right? Their real lived experience.
Right, and the last thing that I would say that it's linked to that I really want to highlight is autonomy, because one of the things that happened until folks started meeting at Highlander and coming up with these strategies, a lot of the anti-racist work was happening by white folks on behalf of black folks. But when you started bringing the folks that were most impacted together, not only to share their stories and to strategize, they started coming up with the plans. They started coming up with the boycotts, with the lunch counter sit-ins. They started coming up with all things, but they also started coming up with an analysis of we need to start taking leadership of this movement, right? And that's at that point where you see a bifurcation in the movement where white folks were told, like, you are important to this movement, but as allies, we as black people, as the people that are most impacted, need to start making the decisions in terms of where the strategy goes, and we need to start having the access to power and to decision makers, which I think is something that's applicable in any kind of social justice movement that folks are working on. So I want to just take a quick breath right now before going to the next slide and just seeing if folks have any either questions or thoughts that are coming up just based on a little bit of history and some of the connections that were made.
Yeah, and Salima is asking about the principles and practices of popular education, and Roberto, we're gonna get to that very shortly, correct?
Yes, actually, that's kind of where we're going next. We're going to kind of break down very briefly what the process looks like, and then give it a more practical application to the field of work. But any other thoughts or questions? And again, I would invite also folks to not be shy and let us hear your voice as well, if you feel so inclined.
Yes. And I'm just looking at the text chat here, so there are questions coming in, Roberto, that like how do we take a strength-based or empowerment approach when approaching domestic and sexual violence, as it fits with popular education? What about specific programs and resources? All things which we're going to get to as we move along in the web conference today. So looks like those are our questions in the text chat.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to give a shout out to Jessica because yes, I was gonna point out a little bit of irony in trying to do pop ed over a webinar, but I think that it's going quite well. So thank you for that little shout out. I moved on to the next slide, which is this is by no means the definition, but it's just a working definition that came up at Highlander, and I want to use it to frame as we get into the steps of popular education. So, popular education is a participatory peer process that combines people's experiences to develop collective analysis and strategies for positive social change. And so the three words that I want to just highlight there is the peer, the collective, and the strategies. And so it's really centered, popular education is very antithetical to just one person, and it's very antithetical to a charismatic leader or one brilliant person that kind of like sets the agenda. It very much is about everybody coming together, everybody sharing those stories, and from there, putting it into action. So I want to check in with you, Ashley, as the facilitators in terms of a quick time check, because I want to make sure to leave enough time for the compañeros that are going to follow as well, and I can kind of streamline the next process, the next part if necessary.
Yes, absolutely. We are at a good time, so you can just feel comfortable to continue on at this pace.
All right, cool. Sounds good. Okay, so we're going to try just like really briefly. We're going to continue this process of trying to bring in the voices that are in this particular room and your experiences. And so the first question that I would ask folks, and that I would ask folks to share is, if folks can think of a positive learning experience that you had, and that could be in a classroom, that could be in your abuela's kitchen learning to make tamales. Like, think of a personal experience where you actually learned something, and what was it about that experience that contributed to the learning of it?
So Roberto, I believe we're asking folks to share this. So what is your story? So you can put that in the text chat. You can raise your hand if you would like to answer over the phone. Looks like Tricia says hands-on.
So hands-on, emotional meaning, the passion of the teacher, being able to feel comfortable and not defensive. Learning through experience is something that's come up a couple times. Anything else?
Someone said getting to make choices.
Getting to make choices.
Connections and safety.
Great. Songs to remember the words. Visual, audio, and okay. Those are really good because learning is such an individualized thing. And I want to. I'm gonna move around these charts for a little bit. I want to share like these learning heads, which is just a really simple tool that we use that talks about the different ways that we learn and what percentage we learn and we retain things depending on how it is that we're receiving the information. And if you look at the slides, hearing only is 20%, seeing only is 30%. If you hear and see, you retain like 50% of what you learn. If you can talk about it as well, 70%. And then if you can add action to that, it's 90%. So there's a lot of different components that come to learning, but the more that the learner actually becomes involved. So this model of like just sitting and listening and trying to regurgitate information is actually not the most effective way to like retain the information that we have. So let me ask this question. I want to take it from the individual to the bigger or the collective right now, and ask folks if you can recall and share an experience of an educational process that helped a group organize or to change something. And that can be in the context of like some kind of political campaign, or it could also be a church group, or it could be a classroom. Like, if we have any examples of like groups coming together to change something, and speak to like what led to that.
Great. So Pam's talking about petitions, team building exercises, which I know I have a lot of experience with. I was just telling my colleague about like building kind of a human pyramid and human sculptures as an example. Co-facilitating, domestic violence trainings, dialogues. What else do we see, Donna?
We're seeing agencies getting on the same page in the state around prevention, marriage equality campaign, anti-discrimination campaign, some policy connections, which is exciting too. So organizing around policy change, walks for awareness, participatory research and analysis. This is great.
So I would ask the folks who listed some group efforts that actually resulted in change, whether it was like legislation or whether it was shutting something down. What were some of the group dynamics that made it possible for that change to happen? Because I think that we know from experience that you bring a bunch of folks into a group and into a room, and even if there's a common goal, it does not mean we're all going to get there the same way, if at all. So what leads to groups being able to come together and make something happen, or what did folks see in their experience?
That's such a good question. I know for me it would be kind of like Jen says, Pam, I'm sorry, says leaving ego out of it and having a strong, authentic leader or two or three who they truly believe in the cause. There's no ego behind it.
We're also hearing all the voices and time that's ongoing work over many, many years.
And I saw one that was like giving people specific roles, and tasks and something to do, which is something that we're going to get more into. So I moved on to the next slide. These are all like really good. And I'm asking these questions, even though we're not hearing each other's voices, so that we can not just share the collective knowledge that's in the room, but also to be able to drop in them as well. So I'm going to start winding this down a little bit to hand it off to the compañeros who are coming next, and just talk a little bit about the different stages of popular education. And so this is a spiral model that's probably the best known, and again is not definitive, but just one way to think about it. And there are 5 to 6 steps in the popular education process. And the first one is always start with people's experiences. Always create the space for people to share their stories. And this is one of the most critical pieces, because this is where you start building the roots of what's going to eventually turn into change. And sometimes I think in the way that we organize and in the world that we live in, we have to move things really fast. But when it comes to this particular part of starting with people's experience, it's important to leave a lot of space and a lot of time. Highlander is known and it's famous for its rocking chairs, and there's a big room in the middle that's just has one big circle of rocking chairs. And every workshop that starts there, every single one, no matter what the topic, starts with a go around of people's stories. And sometimes it's like short, but sometimes it would take hours if everyone had an opportunity to tell their stories. And the reason that that's important is because in sharing those stories, that's where you start to build the trust, and that's where you start to build the cohesiveness around the collective purpose. And it's also where you start clocking if there are differences, because not everyone in the room may necessarily want to get to the same place or have the same idea of how to get there. So that's where you start kind of clocking where different folks are at. And there's different ways to get people to share their stories. You can use a fishbowl. There's story circles. One of the resources I think that is provided with this webinar is a 3-pager by John O'Neill, who is a well-known cultural worker in the South, around story circles and how story circles are used to collect people or to collect the information that's in the room. Once folks are sharing the information in the room, then you look for the patterns. So definitely part of this is like the key listening and the facilitation of this process is looking to see where are the connections in people's stories. So in looking for the patterns, there's a couple things. One is you start to build solidarity across differences. So you notice patterns, right? And in the South, for example, there's a lot of exploiting natural resources in poor communities. So sometimes you would bring folks from West Virginia and Appalachia with folks from like the Deep South near the Gulf Coast, and they both talk about how big energy companies came and destroyed their land and took away their homes. And so you start building the solidarity around this issue, like what are we going to do about this, even though these are two populations that may not necessarily always find themselves in the same room. And so it's important to have a keen ear when folks are sharing their stories. And you also just have a lot of moments that, what in the South we call them moments. So you'll hear a lot of as people are telling their story, and that's a good thing because it means that people are identifying with what's happening. And it's also the part of the process where people start the critical thinking and making the connections and building what's going to be their analysis. To that, then you identify what's the information that's needed. And you bring in new information. Sometimes it's very concrete information, statistics or money or science. Sometimes it's mapping the region or mapping who the power players are, but bringing in the information that's needed. And then having the time to come up with your strategy and your plan. And the important part of that is to practice. Oftentimes, especially for folks that are just coming into their power and deciding like, yes, we're going to take this on, there's a plan that's made out on paper, and folks don't always have the opportunity to go out and to practice it before they go out and do it in real life. So having an opportunity, making a classroom out of it, so folks are actually practicing what it is that they're doing. And then lastly, you apply it in action, and I would say that the last step after you apply it in action is to come back and reflect and figure out what worked and what didn't. So those are like basically the steps, and I'm sorry that our time is so short because each one of these steps could be its own webinar. But I'm going to like wind it down because I think that we're at like 10 till 3, and I definitely want to leave time for the other folks. And the only thing that I would do, I just want to share one story about how this spiral works, and that's the story of folks in Bumpus Cove, Tennessee. And these were folks that in the 70s, chemical companies were dumping chemicals in their land, and people were getting cancer and people were getting sick. And these folks started meeting at that time at Highlander, and they followed the spiral to a T. People came together from around the region, and they started sharing their stories about how many folks had lost babies, how many folks had cancer, how many fish were dying, and making all those connections and finding those patterns and finding like the root causes of it. And part of what they shared was that they would keep going to the companies, and the companies would just give them the MSDS sheets, which is basically the sheets that tell you what are the chemicals that are used, which if you don't have a degree in chemistry doesn't mean anything. And that was all that the company was required to do. So what these folks started doing is they started learning. And they started learning what all these chemicals were and what were the impacts that the chemicals had in the body and how it manifested itself. And they compiled this huge binder, which they then took back to the company and said, these are the chemicals that you gave us. This is what we found out about those chemicals. This is what the chemicals are doing. And here's the data from our public health department that shows all the people that have been sick. And at the time, the folks at the company didn't believe them, because the folks that spearheaded this were two housewives who, in an interview that they gave, talked about, we never thought we could do this. We didn't have a high school education, but sometimes you got to do what you got to do. And they came and they presented all of this really technical work, and they were able to shut down the mine. So to me, that's one of my favorite examples of popular education at work, because these folks did not go out looking for outside help. They were in a region that people were not really interested in helping, and they knew that they had to do it for themselves. And they engaged in this process, and they did, and they were able to accomplish it. So I am going to go ahead and leave it there for now. There's a couple more slides in my part, but I'm going to just stop there, and I'd be happy to follow up or answer any more questions post. But these are 3 resources that I would offer to folks if you wanted to learn a little bit more about popular education.
Great. Yes, and you know what? I apologize for any spelling mistakes. Those are mine. I will go ahead and take the credit in a non-positive way for that. So I'm sorry about that, Roberto, as I had to retype one of Roberto's slides. So I apologize to you for spelling mistakes. But thank you so much. And Roberto, you can stay on with us throughout the rest of the web conference, correct?
Yes.
Great. Great, because we're going to move on into inviting Morgan and Tim now to join us. Morgan and Tim, are you on the line?
Yes, we're here.
We sure are.
Great. Great, and so we're going to talk about popular education and anti-violence work. So we're kind of getting more and more specific as the minutes pass, and now we're going to look at what most of us are doing, as we saw when we looked at who's here, folks working on sexual and domestic violence and related forms of violence, and how do we do this work? How do we apply popular education to our work? So I'm going to go ahead and Morgan, I believe I'll hand you the podium if that is all right with you. Great. So you do have the podium now, Morgan.
So we're going to start, Tim and I, by sharing a little bit of our individual stories before coming together at TAASA, and then move forward with talking a little bit about our collective journey in using popular education for sexual violence prevention. I thought it was sweet to hear Donna talking about how, as a social worker, she wished she'd found out about popular education early. I feel very fortunate that I learned about it in graduate school, not in a class so much as from some friends I was doing some organizing work with who had actually been trained in popular education by the folks at the Texas Council on Family Violence, our sister coalition here in Texas.
And Morgan, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I have had some requests. Just if you can get a little bit louder, that would be helpful for some folks.
Yes. How's that? Is that better?
How is that, everyone? I'll ask you to say in text chat how the volume is. Oh, they're saying no, Morgan. Let me see. I think I might go ahead and I can type in something on our phone to try to just raise everyone's volume. So I think I'll go ahead and look for that code very quickly, and I'll do that. But any more voice projection you could do would be appreciated for the audience.
Okay. I just moved a lot closer now. Is this better?
Yes, that is much better.
Okay. We didn't realize we still had part of the speaker on, so I apologize for that. So since you can hear me now, I will continue. So what I was saying was that I was very fortunate to learn about popular education from some folks who had been trained by the Family Violence Coalition here in Texas, and also by some folks I was doing some Theater of the Oppressed work with. So I came to TAASA really excited about popular education. I had learned about it not long before that. And then I met Tim, and so I'm going to let Tim tell a little bit about his story.
Yeah, so my first kind of introduction to popular education came when I was working in Atlanta. I was working at the Task Force for the Homeless, and I started doing a lot of work with different poor people's organizations and homeless people's organizations. And out of that was introduced to Project South, which is an organization in Atlanta, full name Project South Institute for the Elimination of Poverty and Genocide. And they were really my introduction to popular education. Really, their work is primarily movement building, working with different groups of marginalized, with different groups of, is that better?
Yeah, I'm glad you saw that, Tim. So it sounds better to me. So, you're getting several yeses. So
okay.
Sorry for that little interruption.
That's okay. So Project South was focused on movement building, working with groups of marginalized folks around, again, telling the story, helping raise consciousness, bringing new information and theory in, and helping really people plan for their own liberation. And so that was kind of my experience. And when I moved to Texas, I was working at a local rape crisis center and actually had folks from the Texas Council on Family Violence who were very interested in and were doing using PopEd as an approach to their own work, who came and started talking to us. So when I came to TAASA a few years later, I was also very excited to try and figure out ways to make that a part of the work, to make that a piece of the approach to how we did sexual violence prevention.
Awesome. This is Morgan back again to continue the story. I also forgot to mention that I had the distinct pleasure many years ago of getting to sit through some workshops with Roberto when he was with Highlander. So it was awesome to get to be invited to do some of this work with him today. So we're going to talk through this spiral model and introduce you all to what we've done in Texas trying to use popular education for sexual violence prevention. When I was hired at TAASA in 2006, I was charged with shifting the state's sexual assault prevention work toward a primary prevention approach in line with the Centers for Disease Control requirements, which I'm sure most of you are aware of. And one of the things that was really key to me about primary prevention was that it so clearly needed to be community-driven, and that if we're looking at root causes of violence and thinking about oppression and what oppression had to do with violence, obviously popular education came to mind as the model that we would want to use collectively to look through this. So with Tim here by my side, who is still by my side, we looked at how we would use popular education both to look at prevention workers and sexual assault agencies as a community so that we could use popular education to help guide the direction of prevention work in Texas, but also how we would train them to use this model themselves in their own communities to do really truly community-driven prevention work. So we're going to move through the model and talk a little bit about the ways that we did this. But before we do that, we'd like to hear from those of you who do know about popular education, if you've used it in your work in anti-violence work, and if so, how?
Yeah, so go ahead and you can raise your hand. We do encourage that, and also type into the text chat. How have you used the popular education approach in your work? And so Donna and Roberto, I invite you both to also go ahead and comment or point out anything that you see in the text chat as well. I do see Maria saying, "I use it every chance I get!" Exclamation point. So it's wonderful.
Yeah, Maria's been a great support to us in our work here at TAASA around popular education and just about everything else prevention related.
Oh, this is interesting. From Graham, he's saying, I'm probably using it without knowing I'm using it.
Yeah, I see agreement with Graham, and that's something Donna, you and I had talked about when we first talked about doing this web conference, was the fact that I said, I think a lot of people are doing this and they just don't know that it's popular education.
Right.
Yeah, I think a lot of people who are doing community-driven work are using many of these steps and many of these principles already. That's absolutely true.
We see from Karen shifting trainings from lecture style to dialogue.
Graham's applying it to a specific program, MVP, Mentors in Violence Prevention, in Scotland's high schools. Oh, and David has also pointed out the power and control wheel, very popular tool we use when we talk about domestic violence. The dynamics of domestic violence was actually developed using a Freirean approach. Thank you, David. Okay. Great. So it looks like a lot about students and a lot about teaching. I'm seeing that theme very clearly.
Excellent. We'll keep the stories coming, and we'll start telling a little bit more of our story and hope that you'll continue to chime in. So as Roberto said, and as you see in the model, really popular education is about starting with people's stories. And so we tried to use every opportunity that we had with prevention workers. Since our work has primarily been capacity building with prevention workers, we tried to use the opportunities that we had with them to engage them in storytelling as part of that work, and storytelling around a variety of issues. So sometimes when we wanted to really focus on grounding them in anti-oppression work and helping them to understand what it feels like to dig deep into that work, to tell our own stories about that work, we would start there. And we wouldn't just use the prompt to tell us a story of oppression. Obviously, the prompts will depend kind of on where you're trying to go with it. And so we would say something like, what was your aha moment about oppression in your life? And then people would tell their stories about that. And we felt like this was really important to help move our collective work as a state of Texas forward, to get a sense of what the story of our state was, and also to help people go through these processes that we were asking them to also facilitate in their own communities. So we would also ask them to tell stories about their work. So to get a sense for how their work was happening, what did it look like, what did it feel like, what were they seeing and hearing and encountering. And we would ask them to tell us stories about their vision for their communities and their world. So sometimes that would be to have them tell us a story of something that had happened in their community that felt like it was moving in the direction of a safer, healthier community. And then we would look for, how do these stories connect? What are the things that seem really apparent that we're all experiencing, or that we're experiencing in similar ways? So I loved what Roberto said about creating solidarity across difference, and these stories really do allow that to happen. So even if people aren't experiencing the same struggles in their work, or they don't have this exact same vision, or they're experiencing different kinds of oppression, what are the ways that we could pull out the themes in those stories to look at how our struggles are similar in some ways, or how they might all be connected to the same roots if we trace them back. And now I'm going to hand it over to Tim.
Thank you, Morgan. So I'm going to kind of talk through kind of the next couple of steps if we look at the pop-ed spiral that Roberto introduced us to. And that third step is where you come in and you bring in new information and overlay theory onto those stories and those connections that you've made between people's stories to help deepen that understanding of the different factors that are contributing to the violence and oppression that people are experiencing in their lives. And so when we thought about kind of the information and theory we wanted to bring in to the field in Texas, we focused primarily on bringing back in an analysis based on a social justice foundation for prevention work, and an analysis around oppression and how different forms of oppression intersect, and how all of that contributed to various forms of violence, including sexual violence. And we wanted to also help people not only go through the process of pop-ed, but also bring in the theory behind it and do some training around the practice of that. And then also to help overlay the public health model onto those stories that we're hearing, that we were hearing from prevention workers and that prevention workers were hearing in the field as they were doing their work. And so where we started with that was really getting, and Roberto mentioned this earlier, like getting at the roots of violence and oppression. And Morgan mentioned, like, we actually asked people, what do you think are at the roots of violence and oppression? What are at the roots of sexual violence? Got folks to talk about their own experiences of oppression, and then also tried to be very transparent about how we were doing that and why we were doing that, so that folks could take that same practice back into their communities as they were engaging folks in the community around these same issues.
And Tim, I'm just curious, what were some of their answers to the roots of violence and oppression?
They were all over the place, I would say. Some of the commonalities, some of the common themes I think that came out were kind of this hypermasculinity were things that came to the surface. We also had folks talking about gender and kind of the expectations around gender. We also ran into things that were where I think the laying of theory on top of folks' responses became very important, where we would get things like unfortunately, like dumb girls and stuff like that, where we would also have to talk about those sorts of responses in ways, and that's where, like, laying the theory on that and also balancing those responses with other responses became a very important thing to do, so that we could make space for those to come up, but also address those in ways. And this is where I think pop ed as political education is a very important thing to understand. It is not just pulling from everyone's experience and letting it sit, but it is also understanding that we are headed in a particular direction. We are trying to end people's oppression, and we're trying to promote liberation. And so it's letting those voices be there and those answers be there, but also bringing it back to the group and laying on the kind of a theory on top of that as well to help folks gain a deeper understanding around that.
Yeah, I like how you talk about laying on a theory. I think in this work a lot of times we talk about going, quote, from theory to practice. And in a way, I'm almost thinking about it as this is kind of practice to theory. In a way, we're bringing in the theory after we know people's real experiences, how they're defining the issue that we're addressing, how they are, defining the causes. And I think it's a really important approach, and it also provides an opportunity, I think, to address things like the norms around, quote, stupid girls and things like that.
Yeah, and I think it also let us create a space where folks who had already been kind of thinking about this and already had that foundation could also talk about it, because in many ways the field had become so focused around just sexual violence or domestic violence that there wasn't a lot of space to have these conversations about other forms of oppression, not only in the work, in the lives of prevention workers, but also then when folks went out into the field, that people weren't experiencing just sexual violence. They were experiencing sexual violence and racism and classism and all of those other things. And it created a space where folks, where the assumption was that there were folks in the room who already had a lot of that knowledge, and that we were just then coming in and filling in some spaces with some additional information.
Yeah, and we have some questions coming up in the text chat. So Tim, I can tell you're also reading the text chat. So feel free to answer those as appropriate. And I want to let everyone know that we'll be making a little bit of time at the end to go ahead and answer any questions that were left unanswered. So back to you, Tim.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to try to run really quickly through a couple of these so that we definitely save time for that. So the other thing is that, and Morgan kind of mentioned this, that we were very intentional both about using pop ed as an approach and creating space for people to tell their stories and making those connections, but that we also were very transparent about the hows and the whys of how we were creating those spaces, so that folks could then take that back, and then also sitting down with them and helping them think about how to use this as an approach in their own work. And then Ashley, we seem to be having an issue advancing the slide.
Oh, you know what? It might be because I changed the podium view, but I can change it back to Morgan if you'd like. I'll go ahead and change it back to Morgan. So
okay.
You're seeing Morgan's picture, everyone, but Tim is
sorry.
It's fine.
So then kind of the last piece of theory that we wanted to bring for folks was the public health model, and specifically the socio-ecological model. First, because we kind of had to, because we were doing this work with to support folks who were doing RPE-funded work, and it was a core component, but also because it was a really unique tool, I think, for helping people understand how that, to make the connection between how that oppression was playing out in their own lives as well as kind of throughout different spheres of influence in their own lives. So by gathering those individual stories from their community members, they could start to make a kind of a community story or a collective story or stories, and that they could then, from the connections that they were making to violence and oppression that people were experiencing, also start to understand, not only for us how to understand what was going on in Texas, but for folks in those communities to be able to link their own story all the way up through their community story and the societal story, and to understand the factors that were contributing to the violence so that they could develop a strong plan for their own liberation. So I think, Ashley, if it's okay with you, maybe we'll skip this one question because we have a couple questions at the end. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So when we started looking at, again, back to the spiral, moving out to the practicing, when we were looking at practicing, building in time for folks to practice new skills and teaching new skills, and time for strategic planning, one of the main focuses that we took was around working with folks around facilitation. So folks have mentioned the banking model of education, this idea that we're just coming in as the experts and folks in our audience are the empty vessels and we pour our information into them, that just wasn't effective when it came to prevention work. It wasn't working. It didn't take into account that people had their own experience and their own knowledge. And so we spent and continue to spend a lot of time working with folks around how to make that transition, because when the funding switched 9 or 10 years ago to be more focused on primary prevention, we had a lot of folks who were, including myself actually, in the work I did at a local rape crisis center, a lot of, at least part of it was the banking approach to education, coming in and telling people like what the laws were and what the myths were. And so we really spent a lot of time not only again, modeling and talking about how we were trying to set up the facilitation that we were doing with prevention workers, but then how they could take that practice back, and building in lots and lots of time for practice for that. And a specific piece around that was helping people think through and practice talking about how you make connections, not only between the stories you're hearing from the folks that you're working with, but also making connections between various forms of violence and oppression and sexual violence. So what we would like to hear at this point, either through the text chat or if folks want to raise their hand, how do you talk about those connections, both making connections between the individual stories that people tell about violence and oppression that they're experiencing, and also how do you make those connections between various forms of oppression and sexual violence?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. How do you talk about connections? We did a web conference and have featured CDC's newer document, Connecting the Dots, or I believe it's Connect the Dots. We'll find, David and I will have a race to see who can post a link to that quicker. But we have a lot of work that's around making those connections. So what have you all found for how you can do that? Because I think we all kind of find our own way that works with the communities individually that we work with. So go ahead and raise your hand or put that in the text chat. I think for me, when I talk about the connections, I just talk about it as it's the reality of people's lives. They don't experience things like sexual violence in isolation usually, and I've gotten a lot of questions about, why is this idea of connections, why does it resonate so much with people? And I say it's because that's people's lived experience. These issues and our identities are connected. right? And Donna, you put in the text chat, yeah, it definitely helps to zoom out from the individual and look at what gets in the way of not only surviving but thriving. Karen is saying, talk about power and privilege and apply it to different forms of oppression. Ask people what would have made a difference for them. What change do they want? So really trying to get to really identifying, defining the outcomes that we're looking for. Graham's building empathy, using real experiences to connect people. Jessica is saying it can be helpful to use the personal experiences to then help people think about structural causes of social problems, especially when lots of people in the room have shared experiences. Okay. So as those are coming in, Tim, why don't we go ahead and we'll talk about your community engagement action planning.
The last piece in kind of the step 4 in our application of PopEd to the work that we're doing was really just to sit with folks and help them around thinking about how they would go about engaging their community and how they would use PopEd in that process and engaging their community and helping them develop plans for how they would approach, who they would approach, and kind of how those conversations might go early on. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Morgan.
Thank you, Tim. So obviously after people made plans, we hoped that they went out and did things with them, and usually they did. And so that's where the next part of the process happens, which is really critical to popular education, which is coming back and reflecting on what was done, learning from what happened, and then starting the spiral over again. So some of this process happened collectively as we wanted it to in collective spaces with prevention workers, and sometimes this just came out in the way we provided technical assistance with people, and we would try to do that collectively as much as possible, but really asking people to look back at, so what happened with that process that we planned and that you engaged in? What happened with this, dialogue that you've started in your community? How's that going? What's it looking like? How are those facilitation skills playing out? What's looking really problematic? And to the extent possible, when we would have people together collectively at conferences and training opportunities to also do that collectively so that they could learn from each other. Since in this process, our job is really just to facilitate that learning all happening together and people's stories coming out so that we can all begin to see the commonalities as they come in. And then we begin again. So I don't need to walk you back through the spiral, but the idea is then once we've engaged in the practice and we've learned from it, that we continue constantly to engage in this kind of practice as we're looking to collectively solve community problems. So we want to be honest about the fact that there were challenges, and I've seen some of Chad's very good questions coming in about how this relates to evidence-based practice and how this relates to outcomes and what are the measurable outcomes that you can develop for this kind of work. So I want to at least start by acknowledging that one of the biggest struggles in trying to do this work with as much fidelity to the popular education model as possible was funding constraints. Since funders have a lot of ideas about the way people cannot spend their time, a lot of times doing this really deep community work doesn't look like it's producing any sort of measurable outcomes or even really measurable outputs. If it's like, oh, look, we've just been spending a lot of time together telling stories. So part of our efforts had to be to help people think about what this looked like in terms of quote-unquote deliverables. And part of the struggle that we had with folks, and this actually gets to the being human piece and how that relates to funding constraints as well, is that when people started these dialogues with their communities and got to the overlay of theory piece, a lot of our folks didn't really have a good enough grounding in primary prevention theory at that point to help their communities understand that and to help them understand how violence and oppression are related. And so what their communities would come out with a lot of times is only wanting to do risk reduction work. And not that risk reduction work isn't all right, but considering the funding constraints, that's not what their process was supposed to be about. And so then it was like, well, if we're listening to our community now wants to only do risk reduction, and kind of helping people to work through that process, because you don't also want to take control back from the community and be like, just kidding, we told you that it was about your process, and now that you've told us what you want, like, we can't get there. So that was definitely a struggle that we had, and I'm going to let Tim talk a little bit about buy-in.
As Morgan mentioned, this approach takes a lot of time and commitment to relationship building and patience, because people are not going to tell their stories to people that they don't know, that they don't see as fellow community members. And in order to create enough time to tell those stories and make those connections and kind of raise the consciousness of a critical mass of folks to a point where they're ready to move on to action, it takes time. And so one of the things we ran into, particularly in rape crisis centers where they operate, folks operate in such a crisis mode, understandably, it's hard to understand like why somebody is spending that much time out of the office or spending that much time on doing relationships and doesn't have the same kind of numbers or outputs or outcomes to talk about, particularly when oftentimes those same staff also were responding to crises and were in agencies that were obviously constantly responding to the crises of other folks. So that was one of the things that we really ran into is a deep understanding of the importance of relationship building and of the storytelling process and of this approach to ending violence, because it does take so much time and we operate in a very crisis-oriented field and in crisis-oriented organizations.
And I wanted to answer the other issue that Chad raised, where he said for the average person, risk reduction is their entire framework of experience with mitigating violence. Based on what we said about popular education, it's the predictable outcome of the work. And I started to type in the text chat, but now I have the phone back. That's part of why the overlaying new information and theory and making connections piece of the model is also really important, so that you can help people think about new liberatory options besides the ones that we've been taught to believe in for so long. So like, let's envision other possibilities for what we do about these problems. Let's think collectively about other ways we can solve them. And we didn't do a good enough job as capacity builders in helping people get to a point where they could have conversations like that around what primary prevention might look like, or what anti-oppression work to end violence might look like, and how they could envision those possibilities collectively. And I'm going to be really honest about the outcome question that Chad asked, which is that we never turned any part of this work necessarily into measurable outcomes. We did this, the majority of our popular education work was long before we started thinking really critically about evaluation in our own practice. So we kind of skipped over that. But there are ways that what this work is trying to do can be turned into measurable outcomes. There are changes that you can expect to see or that you want to see, and indicators of that change through this process. So it's not that it's not evaluable. It's going to be a little bit different than evaluating typical education work where there are maybe some clear knowledge gains.
Great.
So, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, that's just Ashley. I was going to go ahead and introduce the question, but Morgan, why don't you do that?
Sure thing. So we would like to hear from you now that you've heard a little bit about our work and struggles and successes, and you've heard more about the model. What possibilities do you see for using popular education for sexual and domestic violence prevention?
Great. So I've typed that into the text chat, the question, and we'd love to hear about opportunities and possibilities that you see with this model. So looks like some of you have already shared, and I do encourage you to email info@preventconnect.org to share more of those examples. We are planning to do a follow-up to this web conference and focus more examples of local work using popular education strategies. So it can seem like a kind of big amorphous concept when we're talking about it, because it's so unique to the community, and I think that's one of its strengths. So for me, that's a possibility. This is a way to truly meet a community's needs, a sub-community, a sub-sub-communities, right? We always talk about doing those community assessments before, so we know the community, we know the issue, we have community ownership, and how they're defining it, what the community thinks the solution is or is likely to work, and to me that's a possibility for popular education. Sierra says, Sierra would love to create a community sexual violence prevention committee comprised of local agencies, and that would be a great starting point. Absolutely. Jessica is using popular education for planning. Getting folks to evidence-informed practices is also meaningful. And let's see what else we have here. Intersections of sexual assault, gambling, and alcohol, right? This is such a good way to get to those intersections, to make those connections that we've been talking about throughout today.
Yep, and Katie says this could work really well with the local LGBTQ community.
Great. I have someone private chatting me that they would love to talk about or explore evaluation and what that looks like with popular education. So that's a nice share too. So thank you, you anonymous person.
I second that.
Yes, yeah, that was Morgan, right? Yes.
Yeah. Let's talk about that.
Yes. Okay, so it looks like this is an opportunity to get to some of those maybe contentious or controversial issues that we have. Maybe build some consensus as well. So yeah, lots of great comments here. So really, really good. And please continue to think of those possibilities. And I want to see Morgan and Tim, if you have any last insights or comments or things that you want to share before it's about 4 minutes left. So before we do our final our final slides, if you have anything else that you'd like to add.
Tim shook his head no in my direction. So
okay.
This has been a really great conversation. I've really enjoyed reading the text chat and hearing what people are thinking. I think it just points to the fact that we could have a much larger conversation about popular education and what it has to do with our work. So I hope that happens.
Yes. So thank you all. Thank you, Morgan and Tim and Roberto. Thank you as well. And Donna, thank you. Donna, why don't you go ahead and talk about carrying the message forward?
Sure. I know we all covered so much ground today, and thank you, Roberto and Morgan and Tim, so much for sharing your expertise. This quote from Paulo Freire, I think, speaks to me because when we think about outcomes and we think about next steps, this can feel overwhelming. But his message is really about that oppression can be changed and our world can be made more just, and that change is possible through honoring the many truths of many people and actively seeking out sort of this critical understanding of power and privilege and resilience and change. And one of his key messages was that we're unfinished, right? And that we're not confined by our current realities or our current labels or experiences, but that there's hope and that prevention really offers a path to that. So we have just a few possible next steps. I think we've got some more webinars coming your way. But one thing would be to seek out additional training, and many of you were asking, where can I learn more? You can always reach out to the NSVRC for technical assistance, and we would work with our partners in helping to get you connected to training. We also tried to post in the chat some links to additional reading and resources. One thing that we can all be doing in our communities is just sharing what we learned today, just having a conversation about popular education with our colleagues and partners in the community, looking at our existing organizations and where there are opportunities to, for example, integrate more storytelling and this concept of facilitation as opposed to telling, making sure that community voices, folks that are affected by sexual violence and oppression, are driving our work, relationship building. And I think Morgan and Tim and Roberto all offered really great strategies to consider. And then finally, seeking out new opportunities and partnerships, because as Paulo Ferreira said, we're unfinished, and that's a beautiful thing. So thank you.
A wonderful note to end on. So thank you all. Encourage you to go to preventconnect.org. We will be very soon we'll be opening more future web conferences. The registration will be posted on preventconnect.org. It has just turned, according to my computer, 12:30 here in California, and that means that it is 3:30 over in Pennsylvania. So I'm going to thank you all, refer you back to the website for these slides and materials from this web conference. And again, thank you so much to our wonderful speakers today, and we really look forward to seeing you all online in this community in future web conferences. Thank you.